Thanks for listening to that technical introduction. And once again, let me officially welcome you to today's webinar. This is part of the Elder Abuse series sponsored by the Government Innovators Network and the National Institute of Justice. And it's focusing on forensic markers. And I'll turn things over to today's moderator, Andy Mao, who is Senior Counsel for the Healthcare Fraud and Senior Counsel for Healthcare Fraud and Elder Justice at the U.S. Department of Justice.
Great, thank you, Jim. And thanks to all the participants and presenters and participating in this webinar this afternoon. And of course to the Harvard Kennedy School, Ash Center, and the Department of Justice, National Institute of Justice for hosting this second in our series on elder abuse. The first webinar that happened a few weeks ago focused on the incidence and prevalence of elder abuse. This webinar will go the other way and focus on, at a much more microscopic level, on the forensics of elder abuse. I think in this age of CSI, the public, including prosecutors and frontline practitioners, oftentimes may have sort of a different point of view in terms of what the science should allow us to do, what the forensic evidence should be able to tell us. And today's presentation will sort of peel away maybe some of those misconceptions and really look at the science and try to inform ourselves better about where the science is, what we can tell from physical markers, potential physical markers of elder mistreatment or neglect, and what they can't tell us. I think it's important, especially for frontline practitioners and prosecutors, to have an understanding about the limitations of the science today, where it's strong, where it's not strong, what's usable, what's not usable. And so hopefully today's discussion will help elucidate that point. We have a very, very esteemed panel. The first person on the panel is Lisa Gibbs. She's an associate clinical professor at the University of California at Irvine. She serves as the Director for Geriatric Medical Education, the Geriatric Fellowship Director, and the Associate Clinical Director of the Geriatric Clinic. Since 2002, she's been a member of the Elder Abuse Forensic Center there. In addition to that, since 2006, she is co-chair of the Orange County Elder Death Review Team. She's been a co-investigator on numerous elder abuse research studies and has presented extensively as well. The second member of our panel is Dr. Richard Harris, who's the Chief Medical Examiner in the King County Medical Examiner's Office in Seattle, Washington, where he served in that capacity since 2000. In addition, since 1995, he has served as the Clinical Associate Professor of Pathology at the University of Washington. Richard has also written and presented extensively on forensic issues, on forensic pathology, and in addition to that, on elder abuse. In addition to that, since 2002, he's been a member of the King County Elder Abuse Council. Rounding out our panel is Sherry Hill, who has since 1999 been with the Anaheim Police Department and since 2005 served in the Family Crimes Detail. She's a specialist, basically a detective, in the field of elder and dependent elder abuse. She's responsible for training professionals on investigating, and she works closely with prosecutors on actually prosecuting elder abuse. She has also presented and trained widely. She's a member of the Orange County Elder Death Review Team, as well as the Elder Abuse Forensic Center and the Orange County Elder Abuse Coalition. We're fortunate to have this multidisciplinary team to really get into what the science is, and then on the back end, how it's actually used in investigations and potentially in prosecutions. So to start us off, I'm going to turn this over to Dr. Gibbs. Are you ready?
I'm ready.
Great. Take it away.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for the opportunity to discuss forensic markers and elder abuse today. Anyone in this field, and I assume most of the attendees here are working in the field of elder abuse, know that it's a very complex field. It's multifaceted. Not only do these cases require the expertise of professionals from many disciplines, but they also require very specific skills and knowledge sets in the assessment of evidence, which includes physical markers, which is what we're going to be discussing today. I would like to say also that it's more clear to me after working in this field for years that utilizing forensic markers really is a combination of art and science. The art of knowing when to suspect something, what to ask, how to work with older persons. Many older persons, as you know, have sensory deficits and memory impairments. How to piece these cases together, which is something that I know Detective Hill and Dr. Harif will discuss, is really an art, but we also need the science, which helps provide guidelines that increase our confidence to pursue our suspicions. So moving forward, the first slide here is a reminder that there are many, many types of forensic markers. In fact, this is just a select list. And all of these require an assessment, which in itself requires knowledge and physiology of older people, and also medical conditions that older people suffer from. And rarely are these findings straightforward like a gunshot wound. We're not that lucky. So all of these, it turns out, may occur in the setting of elder abuse or even in the setting without elder abuse. And that's why it takes an extra skill and extra perception to work and figure that out. In essence, the situation provides the context for these injuries. So as an example, what I'd like to do is provide an example of this art and science by discussing two bruising studies from our own research group here at UC Irvine. Both of these were funded by the National Institutes of Justice. And my first slide here you can see is pathology of skin. To start off, I really wanted to comment that, yes, older person's skin is different, because you're going to hear that again and again. Well, it's because they're old. It's because their skin is thin. It's because it tears easily. Yes, you could say yes, that's true. But then you can also say, but that doesn't explain this. And that's what I'm going to talk about. So just to look at this slide, the younger skin looks a little bit thicker, a little bit more robust. The layers are tied together better than the older skin picture on the right. So in 2002, our group surveyed 101 seniors on a daily basis for accidental bruises. Once we learned they had an accidental bruise, they unclothed for us. We documented their bruises. We documented the occurrence, the color, the progression, and the resolution of accidental bruises that occurred during about an 8-month time span. As you can see from this picture, most of these accidental bruises occurred on the extremities. And you can see a lot of blue and red and yellow dots on the arms. And I guess the second most common region would be the legs. So from this, little finger happy here. So from this study, we realized that mostly, almost 90% of the bruises occurred on the extremities, again, when they're accidental. We didn't find any bruises on certain areas like neck, ears, genitalia, buttocks, or soles. If it was on the trunk, it was so unusual that, in fact, most people knew what had happened. In terms of the color, and many of us in medical school learned that we can almost estimate the time of bruises by color, we found that we couldn't do that in this set of people. In fact, 16 of the bruises were predominantly yellow within the first 24 hours of onset, which is something that usually occurs much later. And if they're on medications that were known to impact coagulation pathways or blood thinners, then people were more likely to have multiple bruises. Then we went on to bruising part 2. So the same group, really headed by Dr. Mosqueda and Dr. Elling Wigglesworth, said, okay, well, now we study people with accidental bruises. What if we study people that have had bruises that we think is associated by elder abuse? And so we partnered with our Orange County APS. 67 older adult APS clients were seen within 30 days following a physical abuse incident. And we actually compared those bruises to the bruises from the 101 persons with the accidental bruises. We found that the location of the people who had basically suffered abuse was different. They were more likely in the head and the neck, the chest, the abdomen, the buttocks, palms, and soles. And in some cases on multiple planes, like the front and side of the neck or the inner outer aspect of the arm. And in some cases, when the bruises were very, very deep, they may not appear right away. Here's a picture as a comparison of the bruises that were found on the 67 victims of physical elder abuse. And you can see, even significantly, many, many bruises occurred on the facial area, many more on the front of the chest and the back. On the picture on the right, you can see that there were many, many bruises on the back side of the arm. And the buttocks have a fair amount of bruises here. So if we compare them, and I'll go back here a little bit to this picture, where you can see that almost none occur outside the arms and legs, we have a much different situation here. Also, it was noted that the inflicted bruises were larger in the persons who had suffered elder abuse. And of those that had suffered physical abuse, which was confirmed by APS, 72% had bruises. The only other, I think, very important point I want to make right now is that sometimes, we say, well, older people can't remember. Older people are demented. But I really want to point out this finding, which is just fascinating. So in the first study, 25% of the non-abused elders with bruises remembered the cause of their bruises. So these bruises occurred during normal daily events. We might bump into a desk, a chair, and it may not make an impression in our minds. But when we looked at the people who had suffered elder abuse, almost 90% remembered the cause of at least one of those bruises. And that speaks to the fact that older people can tell you in many, many, many cases what happened, and leads us into other studies which we can allude to later, but that we really should believe and listen to older people.
Dr. Gibbs, before you proceed, there was one question on whether or not the different colors in your schematic signify anything?
Actually, they do, but I have a better, let me pull, I don't think you can read the colors from that particular diagram. In the paper that was published, we actually do have a better graph where we can follow all of the colors of each of the bruises, but not in that particular one.
Okay. And Jim, you'll be making that available or a link to that?
Yes, indeed.
Great.
Yeah, I could pull it. I can even pull it up now. I don't know how to get it onto the meeting screen, but I can send it if that would be helpful.
Jim will do it. That's okay. If you just proceed, that'd be great. Thank you, Dr. Gibbs.
Okay. So my last slide, I just wanted to say then that, we need both the art and the science. So studies like these give us guidelines to help assess whether physical findings are suspicious for abuse. And in our own field experience, at least from our part of the world, where we've had at least 3 geriatricians investigating abusive cases for a number of years, show that if there is a finding that's suspicious but is actually not the result of abuse, there's usually a very reasonable story to explain those injuries. And so that's what we look for if we do have a suspicious finding without a history of abuse. So then the burden shifts to explaining, okay, well then how did this happen here? You tell me, rather than us assuming that nothing happened. And I think I'll leave it there for now.
Dr. Gibbs, another question that has come up is whether or not where the victim was questioned had any impact on the victim's ability to recall the event. For example, whether or not they were all questioned off-site, whether or not some of them may have been questioned at a facility wherever this took place, or where, contextually, if that made any sort of difference. Can you comment on that?
I can't say that we know that. Oh, I'm sorry. I have a researcher right here with me. So Dr. Dr. Wigglesworth is one of our esteemed researchers here who's led a lot of these studies, who said in this particular study, they were all, I don't know if the person's asking about these particular two studies, but in these two studies, all of the subjects were questioned in their own home.
Okay. And another question was whether or not, to the extent that the victim recalled the source of the bruising, did that tend to correlate more or less in terms of particular places on the body? For example, the people who suffered or had a bruise in their buttocks area or in their arm or in their head tend to remember more than bruises that may have occurred in other parts of the body? Was there any sort of correlation at that level?
So could you just summarize that one more time? So if they occurred in atypical places, they were more likely to, I think I didn't understand the question.
Well, I guess the question was, for example, for those who were identified as victims of elder abuse, whether or not they recall, the people who were interviewed recall more acutely bruises that took place at certain parts of the body than others. So, for example, did people who sustained bruising on their buttocks or in their head recall it more so than people who recalled, bruising in other parts of their body?
Okay. Actually, I'm sorry. I hope the speakerphone isn't going to cause problems, but I have Dr. Wigglesworth here. As far as I know, they didn't. But the question was, if they did remember the cause of a suspicious bruise, was it particularly any place in the body? Like, would they recall a bruise on the head more so than a bruise on the buttocks?
Oh, I don't think we really looked at it like that, but they were remembering the cause of the bruises that were inflicted, and inflicted bruises, by definition, are more likely to be on the trunk or the head or surfaces of the arms where they aren't normally, like if they were grabbed around the arm.
Great. Thank you. Again, a number of questions are coming. Let me just maybe ask one or two more and go to Dr. Hack, and we'll come back again. But one question was, you had indicated that the discoloration appeared within a 24-hour period of time, and it was somewhat yellowish. For darker complexion individuals, would that color also be yellowish, or what color would it be? Was there any sort of look into that?
Well, I think that you can certainly tell the colors, and I don't see any reason why physiologically it would be different, except that I don't believe we had enough subjects in our study to really take a look and answer that question. Dr. Wigglesworth?
The take-home message is that the colors don't tell you that much. I mean, I think the take-home message is that where we used to think if you see a yellow bruise, it's an old injury, and you can't believe what they're telling you if they say it was within the last 24 hours. Now, you just may as well believe what they're telling you regardless of what color the bruise is. Does that help at all?
No, it does. Thank you, Dr. Wigglesworth. And the last question we'll entertain before moving on to Dr. Harif is, someone asked for clarification in terms of how you segregate the two pools of individuals, those who had bruising due to accidents versus those that were identified as victims of elder abuse. How was that segregation made?
Well, they were two different groups. So the first was a community residing group of people, and we had an understanding with the facility, and they said, anytime you have a new bruise, please let us know. And that's how we knew about the bruise, to send people over to study the progression and the characteristics. In the second case, APS were the ones that told us. This report has come in. So they were different, but they were all community dwelling elders.
And in addition to confirmed abuse by APS, we had an expert panel confirm that they were abused as well. So they listened to all the evidence of abuse and made a decision. So we're pretty sure that the abuse sample were definitely abused.
Okay. Thank you both very much. There are additional questions, but I wanted to sort of make sure we get through all the main presentations first before rounding back. Dr. Harif, are you ready to go?
Yes.
Great.
I've been asked to talk about the death investigation of elder mistreatment. Try to give some overview and background and how this applies to the topic. It's important to remember that there's 2 death investigation systems in the United States. Death investigation throughout the United States is not well standardized. It's all county-based, and so different counties will do things differently. There's a difference in the qualifications of those that are in charge of the system. The coroner systems are probably more common, especially in less urban areas where they're elected officials with no specialized qualifications. More modern system is the medical examiner system, where they're run by forensic pathologists that are physicians that are trained in forensic pathology, and they're appointed into positions to do death investigation and qualified by training and education to be able to do these. In general, most of the death investigation systems will have commonalities that will take jurisdiction and investigate these deaths. And as you can see, the topic of elder mistreatment, elder abuse, and neglect is not well represented here. So it takes a little bit of imagination and progressive thinking how to fit elder mistreatment-related deaths into the scheme of traditional death investigation, whether it's by a coroner or medical examiner. So there is a challenge, starting with who's reporting the death. And first of all, obviously, there has to be some recognition that elder mistreatment might have played a role or been part of the person's last days or months. And so we need some level of training, even mandatory reporting, in order to bring these to the attention of the death investigation system. Police are the most common reporters outside of the hospital, and there's different level of review of deaths in nursing homes or in adult family homes. So there is a significant opportunity for lack of oversight regarding deaths, because the medical examiner coroner cannot review all deaths. We have to rely on other reporters. The families actually report a lot of their concerns, and we encourage families to report. So actually media attention to the issue of elder abuse and neglect alerts the families to the fact that this does occur, and they can be encouraged to report to the medical examiner directly. Anybody can report. When we do receive a report, we go through several phases, and most common reports are injuries. These are required by law to be reported. Any injuries that occur in a period of time before death needs to be reported, whether or not it directly produced the death. So in the elderly, hip fractures and from falling, and also subdural hematomas, which are head injuries due to ground level falls usually, are very common in the older population. They're vulnerable to these life-threatening injuries. Subdural hematomas are increasing in frequency in the reports. In our jurisdiction, we get about 250 reports of fatal falls, and it's very difficult to screen these out for any that are suspicious for any mistreatment. And again, the other agencies need to be trained to report reliably, and oftentimes the family becomes the bottom line, expressing their concerns, which, if they are involved in the mistreatment themselves, becomes a bit of an obvious problem. One of the most fundamental reports that we issue is the death certificate, which contains many items that need to be designed to address the issue of elder mistreatment deaths. The major portion is the cause of death, which is the disease or injury that led to death, directly or through a cascade of events. But we're looking for the bottom line as what caused the death. Also, manner of death indicates liability, who may have been responsible, whether it's a natural death or due to an accident, or if somebody is responsible, it would be a homicide. Another section on the death certificate deals with other significant conditions, and this is a section that is particularly useful to indicate issues of neglect or mistreatment. For an example, common death certificate may list the cause of death as dementia, may have led to a pneumonia or other terminal condition, but the underlying cause of death is dementia. And not uncommonly, other significant conditions would include pressure ulcers. Now, a pressure ulcer is an injury that can be due to mistreatment or not, so it's important to know how this injury occurred. If there's good care, if there's adequate care, the manner would be natural. On the other hand, same cause of death, other significant conditions being exactly the same, but how injury occurred, if it were due to caregiver neglect, homicide is the category that indicates that the death is due all or in part due to the actions of another. So it's very important to understand how the injury occurred. This is the most important part of discovering how this would be resolved. So we start with just a summary of what our investigation involves is the first getting the report and triaging the case, responding to the scene if it's outside of the hospital, investigating the circumstances and the medical records, conducting interviews with the assistance of police if necessary, and then doing the postmortem examination, which will reveal the condition of the body, which of course needs to be interpreted. And we take all this information from a variety of sources. We synthesize the information coming from law enforcement, from our own examinations, the medical records, and any other investigative or regulatory agencies, and that will help the prosecutor decide whether to prosecute or not. And this is, the bottom line. But it's difficult to reach this because it takes a lot of synthesis from many lines of information. One of the important means of resolving these is an elder death review to answer the question, did abuse or neglect contribute to death? So we can talk about this later, perhaps, if questions come up, but this is the end of my introductory remarks.
Dr. Harry, I have a question that did come up, which is exactly on point with your last slide, is, for example, with pressure ulcers, you indicated that that's an injury. The question was whether or not that's ever identified also as the actual cause of death.
Yes, pressure ulcer can be a cause of death through sepsis. But as you remember, the basic formula of a death certificate, let's see this slide, we've got many categories of entries of information. We've got the cause of death, and pressure ulcers don't occur by themselves. They're due to something else. So the pressure ulcer, you'd ask, how did this pressure ulcer occur? Someone is intoxicated for a long period of time, can be laying around and develop a pressure ulcer. Sometimes demented, could be poorly cared for, develops a pressure ulcer. So the pressure ulcer can lead to death, but it would probably be either a contributing condition or an intermediate type of condition, because pressure ulcer is always due to something else. It does not develop without a condition in which a person is placing pressure on that particular area of their body that develops the ulcer, that becomes infected, leads to sepsis, and then pneumonia or other complications, including death.
Another follow-up question, Dr. Harrop, that has come up is typically how long can it take or does it take before a pressure ulcer develops, that you develop sepsis? Like, what's the typical lag time, or is there a typical lag time?
Oh, that's always a question that comes up, and is best answered by those that are caring for live people.
Right.
We feel that a pressure ulcer can develop very rapidly and be unrecognized until it develops into a serious condition. The issue for us oftentimes becomes not so much is there a pressure ulcer, but did the caregiver take any actions, appropriate actions, to treat the ulcer or care for it or even recognize it, or was the individual just left in filthy condition so it continued to become infected? And this goes back to that slide that I had earlier. Number one, did abuse or neglect contribute to death? But under that, the second point is, did the caregiver contribute to the injuries, ulcers, or other conditions that led to the death? So again, putting things into context is all important, and that requires cooperation among a number of investigating agencies and the medical people as well.
Dr. Gibbs, Dr. Wigglesworth, did you want to comment at all on that question?
Yeah, I don't think there's one clear answer to that question. Developing infection or sepsis from a pressure sore will depend on, the person's general state of health, other comorbidities, other medical conditions, certainly nutrition and immune function. So whether, pressure sore becomes infected within probably days to weeks is going to be individualized to that person.
Thank you. Dr. Harrop, you had indicated before that obviously training the frontline folks in order to identify potential elder abuse and neglect is an important thing. In King County, do you do training for your police officers? And if so, could you describe some of that training?
Yes, we do some training. We're invited to special seminars and conferences regarding elder abuse topics. The prosecuting attorney's office is very active in promoting awareness, and we contribute to those. So I'm listing here some of the things that we try to encouraging the investigators to perform, from responding to the scene to participating in the elder death review and reporting the death to the medical examiner and coroner. It's a slow process because it's something new, and the police that respond to a scene, we found, do not like or are not used to looking at the body, so it takes quite a bit of encouragement. The best learning tool is when someone makes a mistake and is then corrected, and it becomes part of the learning curve for the whole department. Unfortunately, experience is painful, but that's the most effective way of making progress.
Okay. Okay, I'd like to go to Detective Hill, and then there are a number of questions, but I want to make sure that the presenters get at least their introductory remarks. And Detective Hill, are you ready?
Sure.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, well, just everybody will have to bear with me as I try and navigate my way through my slides once they come up. So I think that all of the other two speakers brought up some really good points. When I first started out in this field, we had about 5.5, 6 years ago, there was a big difficulty for me as a law enforcement officer to figure out what constituted abuse, particularly looking at bruises on the elderly, malnutrition, and bed sores. So if you look at some of these photos right here, actually one of the gentlemen and the bottom one are the same person, and that was one of my very first cases, and unfortunately we did not get a filing of neglect. We didn't know back then, back 5 years ago even, prior to some of these studies that have been put out by the NIJ, what constituted abuse. So I'm just going to kind of go through and tell you what my role is in law enforcement. And again, just bear with me. So basically what I have to do is I go out and I investigate a case with or without the testimony of the victim. Typically in my cases, my elder probably has dementia. They can't talk due to medication, or in some sad cases, they've already passed away due to possible neglect. So I have to put the evidence together based on forensic markers, and that's when I rely on the science that we have from these research projects. Then I'm going to present what I have to the district attorney or my city attorney and get criminal filing. So I kind of want to go over a little bit again. Let me go here first. Basically, just to give you a little bit of background, for law enforcement, in the state of California, we have defined 368A. And basically what that says is that crimes against elders and dependent adults deserve special protection, not unlike the protection provided for minor children. Why? We have to look at elders that they might be confused, various medications, mentally or physically impaired or incompetent, and therefore less likely to protect themselves, possibly not able to report criminal conduct unless able to testify in court. Getting back to why me, as a detective, I need forensic markers. So the very first thing that came out when I started getting into this field was Carrie Burnite, Dr. Burnite, forwarded me the bruising study. And what was really interesting about this bruising study was, as Dr. Gibbs mentioned, the fact that on the accidental bruises, we didn't see bruises on the face or on the trunk, particularly, or on the thighs or the buttocks. I was able to go in and look at my cases based on the location of the bruises as well as the color of the bruises a little differently. I know that there are some law enforcement officers listening right now, and if you think about it, you know, we, again, along with the science, we're used to looking at bruises, and if it was a yellow bruise on the first day, pretty much we were going to say that if somebody came in and they said, oh, yeah, he hit me, and the bruise was yellow, we're going to say, well, they're lying, because people don't bruise and get a yellow bruise on the first day. But this particular study showed us wrong. In keeping with that, also when victims came in and they had bruises in, let's say, on their face or on their trunk, and they were denying any type of abuse, you know, we kind of go along with that and say, well, hey, you know, they're denying that there's any abuse. I don't see any studies that are telling me that this is anything other than they tripped. Certainly the study has made me go back and look at the way I handle my cases much more differently. And I'll go into a little bit more details with some cases that I'm going to be showing you as soon as my slide works. Okay, and we've already looked at that with Dr. Gibbs, so I'm going to skip on. So there are different signs of abuse. We look for bruises on the face, the neck, the torso, the groin, the thighs, and the soles of the feet. And as Dr. Haruf said, we're also going to look for other things. We're going to look for things like bed sores, for old and new fractures. And there's a PhD that's actually doing a study right now on CT scans of elders after death, which I think will be phenomenal for us in the law enforcement field, much like we have CT scans of children when we have old and new injuries. We definitely need that with elders as well. And lacerations. So different signs of abuse. And just to give you some pictures, and some of these might be a little bit nasty. Bear with me, people, because I'm having difficulty getting down to the next slide. Jim, can you get down to this next slide? There we go. 7?
Cher, we're seeing slide 7. My mom didn't like touching her.
Okay, very good. My computer must be really slow then. I want to bring this up because I think this is really interesting. This is actually a case I cannot go into a lot of details about because it's a fairly, unfortunately, a fresh case. This particular woman was found deceased in her home. She died at home. She hadn't been to a doctor in probably, I want to say, 4 years or so. Son is her caretaker. She has unexplained bruising on her right breast, which the son doesn't explain. He can't tell me how she got that bruise right there. But he definitely explains, if you look on the picture, she has a bruise on her arm. Now, when I'm looking at the study, I'm going, okay, this bruise on the upper portion, front portion of her arm, that's a very unusual area. Typically, when we pick somebody up, which is what he said he was doing, we don't pick them up from the front of their arms. So as a detective, I'm going to look at that and say, hey, that's highly suspicious. Somebody is lying to me. The story he's telling me doesn't fit the bruises that I'm looking at. But then I've got this other bruise on the breast. And any way you look at that, that to me, particularly backed up by the bruising studies, to me highly speaks of abuse. So it's a case that I'm definitely going to look at further. Again, this is cases with the coroner right now, so I can't go into details, but I wanted all of you to have an example of what we're talking about when we're looking at the diagrams of suspicious bruises. It gives me extra forensic markers that I can go back and confront a suspect with that I wouldn't have had before these studies came out. Okay, and then I want to go down to is the next one going up, guys, number 8?
I'm sorry, Sharon, before you go on to the next slide, one quick question. Have you ever had or been in a position to try to persuade a prosecutor to prosecute a case when the victim was deceased?
I have, and it's a very difficult thing to do. You know,
how did you persuade the prosecutor to take that case?
Yeah, you really, pretty much at this point, prosecutors so far have walked away. It's difficult because, particularly in the state of California, everybody has the right to face their accuser. You know, on this case, though, I will keep you updated because I think based on what I have, it's going to be a matter of putting together all of the other corroborating evidence. Like, I'll never get a homicide on that last case that we looked at. There's just no way. But what I want to get is elder neglect. So I think on a case like this, how I'm going to persuade them, and this is my goal, and it will happen, is I'm going to take the bruising study. I'm going to take this picture. I'm going to take some other evidence that I had, such as the fact that when you turn that woman over, she had a stage 4 ulcer that went through the muscle mass, that went into the bone. It was pretty horrific. When I pulled the sheets back, her sheets were all clean, but underneath the bed had been soaked and drenched in blood and some other stuff. So I think when we take something like that, despite the fact that the suspect cleaned everything up, I think it's going to be really hard for a prosecutor to, I'm hoping, I mean, if there's any prosecutors listening, we need you on our side. So I'm hoping that when I take evidence like this, along with the suspect statements, they're going to take that case and prosecute it for elder neglect. It's a tough one. So.
Before you jump on, Dr. Harrop, in your situations, are there particular fact scenarios where you found particularly persuasive to prosecutors when the victim is already dead?
Certainly good examination is important. Good photography,
Absolutely.
Good documentation of the injuries, objective reporting, and it's up to the rest of the investigation to put it into context of how this occurred. For example, we can describe bruises, ulcers, and so forth, and the prosecutor and the investigators must put it into context about how it occurred, because we would expect the person accused of mistreatment to provide another explanation. And it's up to the jury to decide who's telling the truth. So that's how the prosecutor, in my feeling, is that how the prosecutor is going to decide whether to prosecute or not is whether they can win the case. And that's going to be dependent on whether the jury is going to believe the prosecution or the defense. So it's a matter of building up evidence, and it's circumstantial evidence, physical evidence from the body, and also from the environment. What type of environment did this come from? And then the jury would be expected to think, how would I take care of my mother? Is this a reasonable condition or an environment for for an older person to be? And this is a challenge because juries have not been used to thinking about these things. And so every prosecution that occurs is probably going to be a lesson for that prosecutor of how to approach these, and that experience would feed back to the medical professionals that are involved in these, the medical examiners, and also the investigators that are interested in these. When we had a recent case that was successfully prosecuted, one of the elements was a pair of earplugs that were at the scene. And I pointed to the earplugs and said, take a picture of those and ask the son what those are for. And he actually said those were so I wouldn't have to hear my mother screaming. And that little piece of information, of course, carried a lot of weight. By itself, very little, but in the context of the entire case, made a strong impact on the jury's mind.
Thank you. That was really, really helpful. I'm sorry to interrupt, Sherry. If you can...
No, I think the doctor brought up some great points, and it's the fact that these cases are not easy, to put together. And I think, like I was saying earlier, we really, as law enforcement, have to work together with the coroner's office, with the physicians, look at these studies that are out there to help support our cases. And right now we're looking at a time where, unfortunately, not all, so I don't want to offend anyone, but it's it is about education. It's about educating law enforcement. It's about educating the prosecution. It means doing battle with not only putting that complicated case together, but going to somebody else and saying, here it is. Here's the case. This is why it should stand on its own merit. And just to piggyback on what Dr. Hurth was saying, get the medical records, get the environment. On this particular case, the lack of medical records. She was diabetic and had a heart condition, but hadn't seen a doctor in 3 years. So putting all that information together, along with working with the coroner's office, I think it's going to be very difficult for a prosecutor to refuse to take it. And when we look at the location of the bruises, which is highly suspicious.
Right. And I would just like to add that we're really having to educate medical professionals. We're putting a lot of effort into even at the university, our medical students, but when we ask people's physicians regarding certain cases of elder abuse, sometimes the physicians really don't know how to interpret different findings either. So it's an education all the way around.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and skip this next one and go down to 9. And here's another example of, is it showing up?
Yeah, Sarah, it is. I think you were right in guessing that your computer is just delayed. So have faith that when you select it, the slide does come up for most of us.
Okay, great. Basically, this is a case that I have referred to in the past, and I call it the football or wrestling case. And this was a case where I was able to go ahead and use results of the bruising study, the original bruising study. If you look at her arm right there, obviously, she has some unusual bruising and lacerations. You see a little bruise on her hand, but then you also see one that's circular, and it goes around the wrist area along with that laceration. And 74-year-old, she has dementia. So we'll go into that in a little bit. She has a 23-year-old grandson at home, and they actually get in a fight over the remote control because she wants to watch wrestling and he wants to watch football. And during the course of wrestling for that remote control, he punches her in the face. He also grabs her wrist, according to her initial statement, and causes bruising and laceration to the wrist area. So right after that incident happened, mind you, she has dementia. So we're getting back again to the fact that when people have a traumatic event, they can typically remember where the signs of abuse have occurred on them. She runs over to a neighbor and says, hey, my grandson grabbed me, he twisted my arm, she's bleeding, cops are called out, grandson gets arrested. The next morning, the entire family brings our elderly victim in and says, hey, look, she didn't know what she was talking about, it was an accident, and a cereal box fell on her, and that's what happened. So obviously, this bruising is not consistent with a cereal box falling on her arm. what I did in this particular case is I was fortunate enough that Dr. Laura Mosqueda came in and did an interview of her and looked at the bruise, and based on the study said, well, this bruise is not consistent with an accidental bruise. It's more indicative of inflicted abuse. And as she's interviewing this woman, the woman keeps saying, he grabbed my wrist and then a cereal box fell. And she keeps going back to, but then he grabbed my wrist and then a cereal box fell. Oh, well, he grabbed my wrist and then I bumped into something. Again, these people, and I'll be curious to see the results of the dementia study coming out, people that have dementia or onset of Alzheimer's actually can be great witnesses, in my experience, to abuse. And I have several cases that I could discuss where I had somebody with dementia that has actually told me how they've received a bruise or an injury from the abuser.
Dr. Wigglesworth, Dr. Wigglesworth, would you mind talking briefly about the dementia study that Detective Hill just mentioned?
Yeah, hi, this is Dr. Gibbs.
Dr. Gibbs, I'm sorry.
Has left the building, but I can certainly give you an overview of the study. It hasn't been published yet, so I hesitate to give too many details, but I can certainly give you a great idea of this study, which was also funded by the National Institute of Justice. So, yeah, herein the problem is that people with dementia are at increased risk for elder abuse, yet, you know, they're known to have, and with good reason, memory problems. So how do we show or convince the public and the prosecutors and law enforcement that they can be good witnesses? Because in most cases, we find that they're not believed by their own families, by healthcare providers, you know, by the police or even the prosecutors. However, there is also some significant evidence that people with dementia can remember memories that are emotionally charged. So our group decided to study this and wanted to know if people with dementia could remember specifically emotionally charged memories of their own lives. It's a good place to start, and it gives us a great foundation from which to proceed with other studies which would be more specific to abuse. And we actually found that that was true. For instance, almost 94% reported remembering at least one substantiated emotional event, and they were very reliable. This study will probably be out in print within the next year, but it certainly will be useful, I think, to prosecutors and law enforcement to show that when there is an emotionally charged event, such as this woman whose grandson attacked her, even though she was not able to give a lot of details surrounding life events in her own daily routine, she was able to at least indicate that this is what happened. So very, very important work showing that, you know, we need to err on the side of believing that people with dementia are reliable witnesses.
Great, thank you. Now, Detective Hill, in practice, how do you approach witnesses with dementia? Differently, not differently? Are there particular tips that you can share, or in ways how you've successfully been able to elicit?
You know, honestly, it's being patient. It's being patient, and what I do is, not that I want to trip them up, but I want to see if they do remember that particular event. I will ask them that question, right or wrong. I'll ask them the question, what happened, and then I'll carry on a conversation about something else. And then I will go back and say, okay, now can you tell me again what happened? Why don't you demonstrate for me? And I find that very effective. If they're capable of moving and walking around, I'll have them demonstrate the event. I had a woman that 3 weeks after the event of being attacked by her daughter's boyfriend was actually able to walk down her hallway and show me how she was pushed and how she almost fell down at the hands of her abuser. And she told me this over the course of several weeks. She didn't know who her granddaughter was, but she was able to tell me that event. So, again, it's being patient. It's asking them what happened, talking about something else, and then going back to the topic again. It's a pretty good indicator if what they're saying happened truly happened. And then typically, because they are elder, you're going to be able to couple that with a bruise of some type. And I don't know, Dr. Gibbs, if you have any more points on interviewing. I know you've done some cognitive interviews.
Well, there is a technique that we like to use, which starts with more general questions. and lead into specific questions. So, for instance, we might just sit down with somebody and say, what happened, to see what they're able to recall. And then from then on, we can go into eliciting memories by cues or category. For instance, did somebody hurt you? You know, again, not feeding them information, but just trying to see what they can give you. And then finally, you know, recognizing maybe a specific event such as, did your grandson knock you down? But if we go from general to specific, it also helps us find out exactly, you know, what they can remember. And then I think what Detective Hill is also referring to is reliability, so that when you come back at a later date, do they give you the same information? Perhaps when another detective or physician interviews them, do they basically give you the same general idea or information? So there's reliability, and then there's also interviewing techniques that you can use, which goes from general to specific.
Dr. Gibbs, with regard to the dementia study, one question that has come up is whether or not you also included Alzheimer's elders.
Absolutely. The subjects in that study were suffering from dementia, and we did not specify any particular type of dementia, and they had from mild to moderate degree of severity.
Okay. And someone wanted to clarify, again, I guess you anticipate publication sometime in the next year?
Yes. Yeah.
Great. Thank you.
And I think that publication in itself is going to go a very long way to getting prosecutors to look at these cases, to the reliability of our victims as witnesses. And also, it's going to, I think law enforcement is going to take definitely a better look at these victims instead of just saying, hey, they're confused, they're on medication. No, they're going to listen to them based on results of this. I apologize in advance for the picture that's on your screen right now, but I think it was important to show that there are bruising and unusual areas that we're going to find on our elders. This will give an example of a person that had dementia, and I'll just really briefly go through it. 78-year-old woman, moderate dementia, goes for walks alone in the morning. She keeps telling her family she was raped. Family was having a barbecue that day and really didn't want to listen. This was actually a case when I was a patrol officer. And so they called patrol out. I get out there, and I'm listening to the woman, and she definitely had, to me, as a layperson, what looked like dementia. She was very confused. But she kept saying that a hooded man attacked her and had intercourse with her. And so I said, well, what did you do with your clothing? And she said, well, I threw it away. Right then, I believed her. So I had her actually go out, show me where she believed this happened. It was in a field. She claimed she never saw him. And then I took her down to have a sexual assault rape kit performed on her. The nurse at this particular hospital actually said, you know what, this lady has dementia. She has no clue. We're never going to find anything on her. And basically what that, she was wrong. This woman actually had oral bruising in the back of her throat. She had anal tears, and she had definitely been raped. So again, it shows why we need to be patient and listen to our people. Even though we think they have dementia, they actually can be good witnesses. And we'll go to the next one. And I can skip any of these. This is just actually, the next one's going to be an example of a bed sore. But if we need to move on, we can definitely go ahead and do that.
No, Sheriff, it's fine. Go ahead.
Okay. It's not coming up for me, but basically I can't see it, but I'm assuming that you guys can, number 13. That's an example of a stage 2 bed sore. Okay. And in this particular case, from what I recall, daughter, it was a hoarding situation. Woman was about, I want to say 74 or 75 years old, victim, just gotten out of a skilled nursing facility 3 days prior, had been released to the care of her daughter, her adult daughter. Her adult daughter at some point observes that her mother is on the floor trying to crawl in a little area to the front door across all kinds of trash and debris, because again, it was a hoarding situation. Daughter leaves her lying on the floor for a total of 18 hours as her mother cries out for help. Eventually, daughter calls fire department comes out and finds the mother. I thought this was interesting because we were talking about bed sores and what would be indicative of abuse. Again, just a little bit of work that I've done with the physicians and coroner's office, it's very difficult to figure out what constitutes abuse on these. So it'll be interesting to see what literature is out there on bed sores. But this particular one, and it's kind of ironic that Dr. Gibbs would happen to be here. I had actually called Dr. Gibbs and asked her what in this particular case would constitute abuse or would lead to bed sores appearing in a matter of 18 hours. And I quote my report, conditions which put elders at risk for developing pressure sores include inability to move, lying on a hard surface, malnutrition, dehydration, and a moist environment such as urine. Well, this woman had been left to lie in her urine and her fecal matter. So I took that information and the fact that this woman also was going into kidney failure and took it to our prosecutor, who said, based on the evidence of what we know this condition to be as far as she got out of the hospital, she was in great shape, but then she gets home in a matter of a short time, she's left lying in this environment and develops a bed sore in addition to kidney failure. The prosecutor did take that case and convicted the daughter of felony elder abuse. So I leave it at that if you have any questions.
There are many questions. One quick question that came up for Dr. Gibbs. With regard to the bruising study, are you aware of any court proceedings where the bruising study has come up and expert testimony has had to be given in connection with the bruising study?
Yes. We often do testify as expert witnesses for our district attorney's office. I think probably the most, the one that's coming to my mind the quickest is a case where, and actually Detective Hill, you had a picture of the chest where there were multiple bruises in the beginning of the slide series. Yeah, right. Actually, right there. Thank you. So this particular gentleman, he and his wife lived in their own home, and she had a developmental condition such as muscular conditions such as cerebral palsy, and she had needed help for years. Well, he was, becoming more frail. So they hired an outside caregiver to come in, and he moved into the home with this married couple. However, unfortunately, he started to abuse the husband. There had been a history of domestic abuse in the past where the husband was abusive toward the wife. So I'm not sure how that played into this situation, but this caregiver started abusing this husband and on a daily basis assaulted him. You can see here that this gentleman had bruises on his chest. They do vary in color. There are multiple. They're in a very unusual location. In addition to this picture, this gentleman had a bruise on the sole of his foot, which is, again, a very atypical region. And then he had a number of scabs or eschars on his anterior legs, which were very unusual. So the caregiver told us that this gentleman kept falling. So caregiver's defense was that this gentleman had a very poor balance, he had dementia, and that he kept falling. And so we were called to the stand and were asked if, these bruises could be indeed the result of falling. And, I think even on an instinctual level, you would say no. Not unless somebody fell from the top of a very tall building. But no, these did not happen from daily falls. This was a result of assault. And certainly all of these bruises are in atypical locations. And both, as an expert witness, you basically, reference materials in your own personal experience. And so that did help the case. The caregiver pled out and was found to be guilty. It was a very important case also because this caregiver had been hired from a senior center. So he had been associating himself with a lot of older people. So fortunately, because of this result, he was kept from ever working with older people again.
And you, Dr. Hill, Detective Hill, to the extent that you...
Why, thank you.
No, advancement's so quick. To the extent that you've been involved in cases, when you are asked to testify, what does your testimony typically entail?
Well, believe it or not, you're going to find this very interesting. Typically what happens when I get cases that show abuse like this, I will go ahead and I take that, as the physicians know, I'll take my case with all the medical records to the Elder Abuse Forensic Center in Orange County, and the doctors will actually review the medical records and write a report for me. I have to say, out of the numerous cases I've had, I think I've only testified once or twice, and on these cases, everybody pleads out because they don't want to compete with the literature that's out there with the expert doctors, witnesses that we have to put on the stand. It's unheard of, but they usually don't go to trial. My suspects usually plead out.
Okay.
Not that exciting, but true.
Dr. Harrop, a question that came up a little bit earlier was with regard to the elder fatality review teams. And the question was basically, who are typically the members of this team? How are they formed? How do they function? Who typically leads them? Can you address that a little bit?
Well, the prosecutor that's interested in assigned to the elder abuse function, actually have two prosecutors now in King County, and they lead the elder abuse. There's a elder abuse council that generally meet and discuss topics relevant to elder mistreatment, whether it's financial or physical abuse or so forth. But then there's a specialized elder death review committee that's composed of the prosecuting attorney's office, the law enforcement representatives from the jurisdiction where the case occurred, and then we have a consultant from University of Washington Nursing School who's been active in elder care issues, the medical examiner's office, and members from Adult Protective Services and Department of Social Services. And it's it can vary, the composition can vary depending on which case, but those are the standard people that meet.
Okay, thank you.
Can I just add something on there? This is Cher. To Andy?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. I noticed that there's quite a few law enforcement watching. It's really beneficial to go to these elder death review teams and not get frustrated because it gives us an opportunity to network with and really work a relationship with a coroner's office. I just found it very beneficial because it goes two ways, and if I tell them, for example, the last one I went to, I had kept during the autopsy trying to get a rape kit done on this woman, and it wasn't going to happen, but at the elder death review team, we decided, hey, look, based on the bruise on her breast, there is a high likelihood that she was raped or sexually abused by her son. So the coroner's office actually went back in and had a rape kit performed.
Great, thank you. Another question I'm sorry to jump around a little bit. There are a number of questions we want to cover. Going back to Dr. Gibbs, in connection with the original bruising study that she discussed, one question that was raised was whether or not you guys try to corroborate or verify the recollections of the participants in the study, or did you rely sort of straight out? Was there any sort of corroboration done in order to, test the veracity of the recollections?
Well, one of the main, first of all, as Dr. Wigglesworth mentioned, those cases were all confirmed by ACS, and then the cases were presented to a panel of experts. And it was a very interesting strategy because, and I was on as one of the experts, we were presented the case, but we were not told whether the victim had bruises. So we asked APS to send us cases of physical elder abuse. We heard about the case. We heard about the history, what the victim said, if there were any corroborating medical records. However, if bruises were mentioned in the medical records, they did not tell us that. They did tell us whether there were fractures or lacerations or other types of injuries. And so based on the victim's history, So we did listen to the victim's story. We did not exclude them in terms of whether they had dementia or not. So this was all comers in terms of cognition. Based on their story, based on the social worker's perception of this case, and based on information from medical records, we decided that, yes, this was a true case of physical elder abuse. And only then did the researchers go back and say, okay, let's correlate now and see if these people had bruises. So I hope that answers your question.
No, that was helpful. Another follow-up, Dr. Gibbs, in connection with the bruising study. You indicated earlier that one of the findings of the study was that the coloration was, you couldn't tell timing of the event based upon the color of the bruise. One question that came up earlier was whether or not, despite the fact you can't tell exactly when the bruise may have taken place, whether or not there's a natural progression in the coloration or discoloration of the skin, or is that also, is there no sort of typical progression?
I don't think you can count on the progression.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, in medical school, we learned that, you know, it started out red, and then it turned green, and then it turned yellow, and so forth. But we're finding with older people that, no, we cannot do that. You know, the colors could skip steps. They could be, as you heard, yellow from the beginning. So, no. I think the main thing that helps us with, and I think Detective Hill stated this, is that if a victim tells you that they were hit yesterday, and you see a yellow bruise, that you should not discount their story just because the bruise looks old, because we know from our study that yellow bruises can occur the very next day.
And in fact, and just let me add on, I believe they also occur, they can be found, if I'm correct, on that particular date of the incident.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's helpful. Sorry to keep picking on you, Dr. Here's another question. Pressure ulcers have come up several times during the course of the webinar. I was wondering if you could talk briefly about the pressure ulcer study that's being done at a UCI.
Sure. This study, again, is funded by the National Institute of Justice, and is actually being has been carried out, is being analyzed. It's comprised of two sites, University of Washington site led by Dr. Maggie Baker, and a site here at UC Irvine led by Dr. Solomon Liao with consultants from the University of Wisconsin. And again, this I think the findings in the study are still being analyzed and have yet to be submitted for publication. But just in a very preliminary fashion, I can say, after speaking with them, that well, actually, sorry, I forgot to introduce the study. So the question was, under cases of best care, do people develop pressure sores? And if so, what are the characteristics of those sores? And at least in a preliminary fashion, it seems like under best care, people still did develop some pressure sores, but those pressure sores were at least occurred only singly or isolated. They tended to be smaller and over the bony prominences that we would expect. So there's a lot more to come based on those results, and I would hope that that would be published in the next year or so too. But very important work to even let us know whether or not pressure sores will develop in the cases of best care, such as you know, our best care in nursing homes.
Great. Another issue that's come up, Dr. Harrop, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about mimickers, what they are, and how you address them in your autopsies and analyses.
Yes. This is a problem that comes up, I think, in several different contexts, like in child abuse. Mimics of child abuse, where we learn to recognize something as being pathognomonic or distinctive or without argument, a sign that something has occurred. And carrying this over into elder mistreatment, certainly this has come up several times, is that the injury itself is not necessarily specific, and it's always necessary to relate the injury to what has occurred, what we know has occurred, and what we can prove reasonably has occurred. And so a bruise on a certain part of the body may suggest something, but it's not going to prove anything. A bruise is merely an indicator of an injury, of an impact or pressure, force applied. And the important thing is to support what we think with additional evidence. So virtually anything can be a mimicker of abuse, and it requires diligent investigation to point the direction to how it occurred. So I don't think anything's going to be pathognomonic. That means that by itself is proof. It will be very interesting to know how we eventually view pressure ulcers, but I think it will remain that pressure ulcers will develop because not everyone will be cared for in the best circumstances, and just not being able to afford the best circumstances probably will not equate to proof of neglect.
Thank you. Dr. Harrop, have you been asked to testify in connection with the prosecutor's office in King County?
Yes.
About how many times have you testified?
Oh, I think probably less than 10. We haven't had many cases that go to prosecution. Many times they're settled before it goes that far. But I would testify in terms of the medical evidence and what would be expected. But I think it's been pointed out before that oftentimes the evidence is so compelling that the defendant may not want to face a jury of peers because the evidence that's being presented is just so horrific that it just doesn't look good to be sitting there being accused of doing this to, for example, your mother.
Right, and in those instances where you have testified, to the best of your recollection, what has been the line of attack that defense counsel have taken with you when you've been on the stand?
Well, the predictable ones will be, isn't this partly due to natural disease? And this is always a big issue. How much of this is natural disease, how much is age-related changes, and how much of this is neglect? And the defense would be that this is just a consequence of the aging processes. This is a consequence of natural disease, and neglect had nothing to do with this. So we have to learn and educate the jury what's to be expected in natural diseases, what is expected in age-related changes, and how to draw the distinction between the two. But in general, it's fairly straightforward because there are medical professionals that deal with old, sick people all the time. The trick is to get them to the point where they will contribute to this process effectively.
Thank you. One question for Detective Hill.
Yes.
The question is, how often does financial exploitation drive neglect in your experience? And do you also do financial crimes as well in your work?
I don't. I handle physical abuse of elders solely, along with my caseload of family crimes cases. But I'll tell you what, always. every case that I get, there is definitely some type of financially driven objective on the part of the abuser. Whether, like this, particularly this last case, the gentleman was living with his mom, so he stands to inherit that house if she dies sooner. And that's typically what I see, but definitely, I think every single case of physical abuse, we need to look at the economic aspect of it as well.
Actually, Andy, I have a couple of slides on, not to leave financial abuse, but on pressure sores that we might get to eventually that might help the attendees.
Sure, that'd be great. Detective Hill, were you done with your response?
Yeah, I just think that whenever, absolutely, what the question is absolutely they're always financially driven, or whether it's benefiting from a house. If you look at, I have on my very first slide, not to cut you off, Doctor, but there's a picture of a bed sore up on the very first. And if you look at the guy that's emaciated right there on the right, upper right, in that bed sore that was back there, and I think that was 12 centimeters around, and it went all the way to the bone. This woman, actually, his conservator was his granddaughter, and she actually benefited $300,000. She sold both of his homes, took over care, and also took his morphine while she was at it. But and this is the condition that she left him in. So.
While Dr. Gibbs puts up her pressure ulcer slides, a question has come up in terms of how often any of the presenters have made referrals to APS.
Every time I get an elder abuse case, I make a referral. We're mandated reporters. So.
Yeah, the medical examiner's office makes reports to Adult Protective Services frequently. They're very effective. They can digest medical records and provide very useful summaries very, very nicely for us.
Dr. Gibbs, anything to add?
Will we make, yeah, so I'm sorry, I was looking for my slide, but the question was how often we make presentations to APS. Yeah, we educate, are involved in educating APS both within our own state and in other states, and all of our geriatricians and psychologists have been doing so for quite some time.
Great, thank you. I see the pressure sore slides are up. Do you want to address that briefly?
Yeah, just briefly. I'm sorry if it came out of context. Just in case some of our attendees aren't familiar with pressure sores, these are just, again, some slides of skin pathology, which shows a progression of pressure sores from just a reddish circle on the skin to a little ulceration, then to something a little bit deeper, which reaches into the fat and muscle, and then finally on the lower right into the bone and tendons and connective tissue. Again, this is line drawings that we had someone draw for us, showing stage 1 through stage 4. And then sometimes you can get a scab or an eschar over a very deep ulcer. And just for the sake of our attendees, when you see this, you really don't know what's underneath until they get a medical exam. So it's very important when you see a scab over a bony prominence to really have that attended to. The exception there is that we leave scabs or eschars on heels, but in the other parts of the body we do not. So the other slide I thought that might be helpful, because a lot of the social workers end up going to people's homes to really assess for neglect, is this cartoon shows different treatments for pressure sores. So for instance, when you're in the home and you're suspecting a caregiver of neglect, you can ask these sorts of things. For instance, at the lower right, well, how are you taking care of this sore? Are you using dressings? Are you packing it? Who is? Is there a wound nurse coming in to take care of your mom's pressure sore? Do you have pain control? Some pressure sores, depending on where the nerve endings are very painful. In terms of pressure relief, they may need a special mattress. And if a person is laying there with multiple pressure sores and no one has mentioned or even observed a person's mattress, then that may be a sign that they haven't had the right medical care, or they're not getting medical care. So anyway, just a cartoon to show you that these may lead investigators to ask the right questions in terms of whether somebody's being taken care of appropriately.
A follow-up question with regard to your slide. Someone asked, what is the benefit of debridement?
The benefit of debridement is to take care of the necrotic tissue or the dead tissue so that the healthy tissue underneath can have access to oxygen and nutrition and help heal.
Okay. And then a general question to all the panelists. Have any of you testified or been involved with testifying in a matter against staff of nursing homes or assisted living facilities in a case involving elder abuse or neglect?
Yes. I had one case. And basically it was too bad. The victim had Alzheimer's, and there were two witnesses, two CNAs that observed the suspect, another CNA, basically take this elderly woman that was 90 years old and slap her around, take a robe, and attempt to choke her out with her bathrobe and then throw her on the bed. And by the time the CNAs actually reported it, because they were fearful of losing their job should they report it, and by the time it came to me, the victim didn't have any bruises on her. Again, she was unable to tell me her side of the story, but based on what we did know, based on the witness statements, based on medical records that indicated that she did have bruises following the event, my city prosecutor took that case, and it's very disturbing, the result of it, and I think it was a big learning lesson. She picked a jury that she thought would be friendly to elders because one person had one of the jurors had their mom in a home, another couple of jurors were elders as well. Defendant gets on the stand, says that admits to hitting her and everything, and just says that the CNAs, however, were being vindictive, and the jury came back not guilty. So it was a big learning lesson on who not to pick to be on your jury, and very disturbing as well.
Right. Doctors Gibb and Harris, any experience testifying in a nursing home case or an assisted living facility case?
I haven't testified in those cases, but we do have done a lot of medical record review and review of licensed facilities for community care licensing in Orange County. And I think it's been fairly successful. I think once we look through the record keeping in licensed facilities and compare them to subsequent emergency room visits or hospital stays, we've been able to help those investigators significantly, and I think that many sanctions and penalties have gone out, including closure of facilities because of our reviews.
Right.
I'll show you one case if you'd like to go to my slides.
Sure.
So do you have, let's see, I'm going to go to this one. This is an interesting case. It involved an adult family home employee. A woman was found in her bed, not moving, and was transported to the hospital with the diagnosis of a stroke. She didn't act much like a stroke when she was fully evaluated. They did this MRI of her neck showing a massively displaced fracture, broken neck, and pinching of the spinal cord as well. So this was a puzzlement for some time. It finally became apparent that somebody had moved her back onto bed, placed her onto bed. Oh, I remember somebody said that they found her on the floor trying to say that she'd fallen out of bed, and we testified that this would not be consistent with a fall from a bed. This is a type of fracture that you'd see in motor vehicle collision. The neck has been forced forward, not backward. Anyway, so the resolution was that an employee was mishandling this woman. She would resist being moved from her chair by gripping on, and he'd grab her by the head and pull her forward. One time he caused a bruise to her face, and this time he probably broke her neck. I think the prosecution was not so much towards this employee, but towards the facility who had employed this person without having any qualifications whatsoever and failing to manage his behavior in an appropriate fashion. So it was what they call maybe corporate neglect, or so the action was against the corporation rather than towards the individual.
Thank you. Another question for...
I'm sorry, Andy, can I add something on?
Sure, please.
Not about a case, but the difficulty, at least in our state, is we know that there's abuse that occurs in skilled nursing facilities, but the problem is that the mandated reporting is very different than it is outside of the facilities. So we don't get these reports. We don't see the abuse. We just don't see it. It's not to say that it doesn't occur.
Right.
That's all.
But are there networks through which you get information like that? I mean, in a prior discussion, you had talked about EMS workers always knowing, sort of.
Well, they do know, and unfortunately, a lot of them are, from my conversations with a lot of the EMT workers, they're very fearful of reporting. And I think, too, you know, and this is just a hypothesis, I think that people become so used to seeing abuse, and particularly bed sores and bruises out of facilities, that they just don't report it.
Right.
Sometimes we'll get them when they go into the hospital, you know, having been transported from a facility, but we're not getting them from the facilities themselves.
Right. A question for Dr. Gibbs in connection with the anticipated pressure ulcer study. Mm-hmm. One of the interesting things in the study, I think, is the fact that pressure ulcers can potentially take place even in facilities that are, you know, providing good care. Mm-hmm. But I guess the question is there any sort of thought to looking at whether or not the prevalence of pressure ulcers in those facilities that are giving good care is much lower than in other ones?
I think that's a great thought. I mean, a review of the probably MDS data or data that all facilities have to turn in. It would be interesting to compare that data and numbers of the prevalence of pressure sores with, for instance, statistics on the quality of care that they give. I don't readily have that information with me, but I think that would be an absolutely valuable thing to do if it hasn't been done already.
Okay. As an aside, I would note that we have a number of international participants as well as high-level folks on the webinar. So to the extent that you want to share anything in terms of your experiences, of course, we welcome those comments. A more general question for the panelists is, why is mandated reporting different for facilities than it is for the outside world? I think that came up a little bit earlier. Does anyone have any thoughts on that?
I can say something. It might not be appreciated. But, you know, in the facilities, the reports are made to the ombudsman, not to Adult Protective Services. Ombudsmen are not mandated reporters to law enforcement. However, Adult Protective Services, who handle any types of abuse or possible neglect out in a residential setting, are mandated cross-reporters to law enforcement in our state.
Great. Thanks. Dr. Harrop, with regard to your interaction with the prosecutor in the King County office, typically what does the prosecutor's office find the most important from your evaluation? I mean, how specific do they typically want your testimony to be? Do they try, I mean, for example, in terms of the cause of death, I imagine that is a critical sort of statement in the death certificate, and sort of has, you know, in your experience, has sort of what you put down at each one of those things sort of evolved over time in dealing closer and closer with the prosecutor's office? or has it changed at all, or has it been sort of fairly steady? Has it been sort of, you know?
Well, we've developed an appreciation of what's important, and so I can anticipate some of the issues, and the prosecutor has developed an awareness of how to approach the different issues. We mentioned before the confusion between neglect and natural disease and age-related disease. Have to add to that also the issue of self-neglect and how to distinguish all these things. And of course, I don't try to answer everything outside of my area, but it's useful to refer to some of these issues that are outside of the strict medical arena. So we try to address not just one single issue like the cause of death. The cause of death might be a natural disease related to, for example, dementia or heart disease. And when I discussed the death certificate before, there's more to the death certificate than is first appreciated. And the significant contributing conditions that are outside of the main cause of death are very important, because any contribution to death is important. Not just the main cause of death, but any other contributing condition. So the pressure ulcers become important as a contributing condition. And as it can be shown, if the caregiver had contributed to those ulcers, then the caregiver is responsible for the at least partially for the death. In other areas of criminal law, similar thing would occur if, for example, if a purse snatcher were to grab a purse and push an old woman down, she injured herself and died of those injuries, that would easily become a homicide. The hump is understanding that the same thing occurs if a caregiver produces a situation in a vulnerable individual that results in the death. So the interaction with the prosecution and the defense is explaining the entire picture, not focusing on, of course, one side will want to focus on the pressure ulcers only, and the other side will want to focus on the natural disease and aging processes only. But a correct understanding has to show how both conditions interacted to produce the outcome, which in my case is death, and then did another person, the caregiver, contribute to this consequence, and was that caregiver obligated to do something other than neglect the individual?
All right. Thank you. Our time is running short, and I just wanted to ask, for purely selfish reasons, since we have such an esteemed panel, to the extent that you could have one forensic research question researched or analyzed or funded, what would it be? What do you think would help you most in your respective lines of work in terms of an area of forensic research out there? I open it up to any of the panelists.
I knew you were going to ask that question. I just had a feeling. This is Detective Hill. First of all, the bruising, absolutely brilliant. I might ask for two, Andy. The dementia study, that is going to be extremely helpful to us in law enforcement and for prosecution purposes. The bed sore study, but I would also be curious to see, I think as we were discussing earlier, under some different settings, under some extremely great care, is somebody going to develop a bed sore? Under the optimum care that one can have, that I would expect from my mother, would a person develop bed sores? And then if I could ask for two, I think the other thing that's really important is I know that Dr. Barry Daly is doing some work on CT scans, and I believe it's after death. I'd be curious to do skeletal surveys on elders at any time. We don't do that. You know, maybe the doctors can correct me, but I haven't seen a skeletal survey on an elder. But that would really help me when I have an elder go into a hospital. You know, what are the stages of the breaks on this person? You know, is it an old hip fracture? Is it new? There's a couple things on my wish list.
Sounds good. Dr. Gibbs, Dr. Harris, any thoughts?
I think, you know, other types of injuries. I mean, we really just got started with the bruising and the pressure sores. But I think even in our caseload, we've missed cases of strangulation, of basal skull fractures, fractures in general. You know, I think you could do a lot of work with other types of injuries in terms of identifying the characteristics and whether they present differently in older people or not. So bruising is just the tip of the iceberg. There are so many other injuries that occur in older people that we should take a look at that occur commonly. Some occur commonly, such as hip fractures and other types of fractures. We have chronic conditions that predispose people to that, but I think there must be characteristics we could learn about that would help us differentiate abusive situations or abusive injuries from non-abuse. You know, and again, the other things I think that typically medical personnel and law enforcement may miss, such as basal skull fractures and strangulation, would be key.
Dr. Harris, wish list?
Oh, I think the question comes up most often for us is how long did that pressure ulcer take to appear? So I think increased understanding on pressure ulcers would help understand the issues of neglect. For us, abusive injuries resulting in fatalities are pretty straightforward. So our issues are more with respect to neglect contributing to death.
Thank you. I think we're about to sort of wrap up, but Jim, I was hoping that you could sort of clarify that both the bruising study that was discussed would be sort of made available, as well as the slides from the presentation. I think a number of the participants were hoping to look back and take a look again on at the slides that were presented.
Yes, indeed. So we'll be posting the recording of the webinar along with the presenter slides on the Government Innovators Network website in about 2 to 3 business days. Because you provided your email when you logged in today, I will notify you by email when those become available, and I'll provide a link so that you can get directly to it. In the meantime, I have updated our resources list. Hopefully some of you have already taken advantage of this, and we may even add a few more links to this over the next few days, but the bruising study in question is now the second link down on that page. It happens to fall right below the centerpiece study from our last elder abuse webinar, the incidence and prevalence event. So those 2 studies are at the top, and then a whole lot of resources below that relevant to both webinars are there as well.
Great. Well, I think that's all from our end. Jim, do you want to take us out?
Well, I'll let you say the final goodbye as moderator, but I just want to say thank you so much to you for some excellent moderation. I know it's not easy to do on a webinar, and to our panel for just really a great presentation. I love it when you guys comment on each other's slides and pull out slides from your pocket, and I think this was just a fantastic presentation.
I'll just echo. Thanks to all the panelists, and thanks to all the participants. All the questions really came from the participants. So thank you all for taking the time to listen and participate on this important matter.
Well, thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, Jim.